Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 239th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And March is, of course, all about Women's History Month and looking at systemic changes for better and progress. And that's what this series has been focused on, which I really hope you've enjoyed. If you have, don't forget we can work together. I can support your workplace with audits, conversations, team programs focused on race, mental health, and the intersection with gender. As always, you can get in touch with me at Leyla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. And also don't forget you can watch my TEDx talk, and that link is in the show notes. It's bit.ly/TEDx Wolves LO. And I really hope you enjoy it because it was a labor of love. And if you did, do share and like. So this week we're talking about burnout. And if you want to know more about burnout or 101, then listen to episode 114, Identifying and Combating Burnout. But today we're speaking specifically about burnout in South Asian women. And I'm joined by Neelu Kaur. Neelu is a highly sought after keynote speaker, workshop facilitator, and executive coach focusing on leadership development, self-advocacy, and burnout management. She's worked for Fortune 500 enterprise teams such as Sony Music, Google, Ernst Young, RBC, Jefferies, to name a few. And in 2023, Neelu published Be Your Own Cheerleader, which focuses on self-advocacy for underrepresented voices in the workplace. She holds a bachelor's degree from NYU Stern School of Business, a master's degree in social and organizational psychology from Columbia University, and she is a certified NLP master practitioner and a coach from the NLP Center of New York. So it's always really great to have guests from around the world. Really excited. So Neelu, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leyla. I'm excited to be here.
Really exciting to have you. And I just read out your bio, but it'd be really great if you could tell listeners what you're working on at the moment.
Sure. So I am in the midst of, here in the US, we're in March, mid-March, and AAPI Heritage Month is coming up in May. And so I'm gearing up to do book events around Be Your Own Cheerleader, speaking engagements, and workshops all around self-advocacy. And not just for Asians and South Asians, but for people in general in the workplace. So extremely introverted people, neurodivergent folks, like anyone that struggles with self-advocacy issues, I'm gearing up to do a speaking circuit on the topic.
That's very exciting. And API in America's Asian Pacific Islander, right? Heritage Month.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's different. It has different acronyms. Sometimes it's Asian American Pacific Islander. Sometimes it's just Asian, and then it encompasses South Asian as well. So it really depends on the organization.
Fab, yeah, because we don't have it in quite the same way. I think as I was talking to you earlier, Neelu, we have South Asian Heritage Month from mid-July to mid-August instead. So yeah, always really good to know about that.
Yeah, we have that too. Like specifically for Asians and during that time frame. But then May is sort of like the overarching umbrella for just Asians and Pacific. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Always good to know. And you talked about your book, Be Your Own Cheerleader. And before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, how did you become an executive leadership coach? What was your journey?
Yeah, so it's been a long journey. That's why I'm pausing. But my master's is in social and organizational psychology. And so I've really focused on adult learning and leadership development since I graduated, which was in 2009. So it's been a long journey. And as I was in the training and leadership development space, I then went on to attain coaching certifications. And then it was kind of like a natural segue for me because I noticed when I was facilitating workshops or speaking on panels or on different stages that people wanted to work with me one-on-one. And so then it was just this natural progression to then become a leadership coach as well.
And do you enjoy that role? Like, do you, because I think there's specific things, isn't there, about executive coaching versus maybe quote unquote normal coaching or non-executive coaching. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I really enjoy, so I feel like I like to stay in my lane, and my lane is in the workplace because I grew up in corporate America. I've been in corporate America. I've facilitated in corporate America. So I really feel like I understand the politics and the dynamics of how things work in the workplace. And so that's my area of focus. But I would have to say I prefer groups and teams. So I would say that if I had a choice, my portfolio always leans heavier towards speaking engagements, group facilitation, workshops, and then I have my individual coaching clients. And some of those clients I've been working with for years, but I definitely think my portfolio sways more on the group and team level than on the individual.
Brilliant. And thinking about then, executive coaching, working with executives, but really for all of us, I think, as we touched on before the pandemic, what does the term burnout mean to you?
Yes. So burnout, and it's interesting because I don't know about the UK, but in the US, everywhere you turn, it's a term that is just used so much. And specifically during the pandemic, it was all about work-life integration. Like, how do we create these boundaries at home that let us have our life after we finish working and all this? So I think burnout to me is really sort of managing the day-to-day stresses of life. And when we get overwhelmed, when we can't focus, that's sort of an indication that there's burnout there.
Yes, and often I think sometimes we don't recognize that we're going through burnout until we really reach that crisis point. And I think building on the idea of South Asian advocacy, the work that you do, what about burnout, mental ill health, and culture? So from our South Asian backgrounds, what do you think the biggest challenges are in accessing support?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So my parents are immigrants. I was born in India, raised in the US. And one thing that I learned from my parents is really like working very hard and heads down, just do good work and your work will speak for itself. So that in and of itself is a problem in corporate America, which is a very individualistic a very individualistic place and or culture rather. And then you go to say India or Asia, it's very collective. So I find that South Asians have a very hard time with sharing their concerns, sharing their needs, and that can lead to burnout. So if they're not able to self-advocate because it's not a skill or muscle that we learned, and that actually contributes to burnout because they're not able to speak up and say, hey, I need support. I need an extra pair of hands, or I need to log off early to take care of my parents or my children. I think there's just a lack of that awareness and muscle to speak up for their needs.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think even those of us who were born and brought up in the global north, I think we still face that because of the importance of that collective culture. And I think also we might not ask for what we need at work, and then we don't ask what we need at home, and then we're doing everything, and it is absolutely exhausting. And we think there's no options, and often it's very difficult to fathom what are the options in this circumstance. So yeah, I really couldn't agree with you more, but I think it's very hard to ask for help because often, and I don't know what you think about this, Neelu, but we ask for help and we get told no.
Yes. And what's interesting is in a lot of my workshops, I always say, like, how we are in one situation is how we are in another. So let's start practicing wherever you feel more comfortable. So some of us might feel more comfortable to practice with our partners or our family, and some may feel more comfortable practicing speaking up and asking for what you need at work, right? So it's just like we are a system and we are the same person whether we're at work or at home, right? We want to be that whole self. And so I say one of the things that I think is really important is just practice any chance you get on how to be your own cheerleader.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I remember going on assertiveness courses years ago, and one of the facilitators, she was white British, so it's not related to the culture piece, but she said, "Oh, I tried to practice assertiveness at home with my husband and my sons, and it was a disaster. And actually, it was much easier to practice it in the workplace." So, yes, really helpful advice. And then what about, there's the individual side, but what about workplaces? Really, what should they be doing to think about burnout and the way different people may experience and show symptoms of, if you like, burnout? What should workplaces really be doing?
So one of the things I've noticed with many of my clients, and you and I were talking earlier, and I was telling you that I work a lot with tech companies, and I work with some of the very large tech companies as well. And so one of the things that they do is, for example, for deep, innovative thinking, they say no meetings on Fridays. Now, whether they stick to it or not is a different story, but they try to implement some things that allow people to not be overwhelmed. So what happens is if you have a meeting like one after the other with no break in between, it's an overload on your cognitive functioning. So that contributes to burnout. So some of the companies I work with, they say the meeting actually cuts off at, say, 20. If it's a 30-minute meeting, it'll cut off at 20 minutes. If it's an hour, it'll cut off at 50 minutes. So they want to give these 10-minute buffers just to process and synthesize information. And I think in our day-to-day, we are sitting in meetings so much, and that is one of the biggest culprits of burnout. And so I think what workplaces can do is actually create these mandates, but stick to them. So if you are a meeting heavy culture, giving your employees time to process and synthesize information between each and every meeting. I think that is a great first step.
Yes, and super practical and easy to do, and it's not costly. So thank you for that. And I'm also thinking about people go on training all the time, or they go on training and how they integrate that. And actually, just to be human and check in on people and say, we have this big campaign, part of what was Time to Change, Rethink Mental Health, where you say, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine, blah, blah, blah. No, how are you? And really give space to have that conversation. And I think that works across cultures, or at least it starts to build a relationship to say, you know what, I'm listening to you. And I know we've got a 10-minute buffer between meetings, but I'm here if you want to talk.
Exactly. So it's just adding a human-centric approach, also giving people space to just process information. I mean, typically when I finish a meeting, there's notes I have to take, there's things I want to remind myself to do, there's action items I have, right? And so if I don't have time to do that, by the end of the day, if I've done that over and over and over again, my mind and my brain is just fatigued. And that really is, those are the days where I feel the most burned out.
Yeah. And that's a really important point, isn't it? It's recognizing it within ourselves.
Yes, absolutely.
And then building on that, my favorite question that I ask all my guests is, how do you look after your own mental health as an incredibly busy professional? What are your top 3 tips that you'd like to share with listeners?
I love giving very simple, practical things that don't cost any money, because everything out there, you can download all of these apps, you can, do this, you can do that. And I say there's the one simple thing that you can do that will set yourself up for success. I say this over and over again is, do not reach for your phone for the first hour of your morning. And if you can't do an hour, the first 30 minutes, because essentially what happens is, if you reach for your phone and you start looking at your phone, you're going to look at emails, text, social media, WhatsApp, all of these things. And then you're training your brain to be reactive. You're training your brain to be distracted all day. So that is one easy thing you can do. Use another. If you don't have the discipline to not pick up the phone and you use it as your alarm, try to find another source for your alarm to wake up. But I think the phone and devices first thing in the morning is just setting yourself up for overwhelm and burnout throughout the day. So that is like my first tip that I say, absolutely non-negotiable. If you can't do an hour, let's try 30 minutes.
And any other tips that you can share, top 3?
Yeah. So I think the other one would be movement, right? So throughout the day, between those meetings, right? When you have a few minutes, any sort of movement, because motion changes your emotional state. So if you're feeling overwhelmed from one meeting, simply by just walking around your apartment, walking around your building, wherever you live, just taking a quick walk. And it doesn't have to be like this extensive workout, but any form of movement is going to help change your emotional state. So I think that is one thing you can do. Even you could switch and say, okay, I've been seated for 3 meetings. I'm going to switch and stand up for the next, and I'm going to move around a little bit. So movement is a great way to just get the blood flowing and actually helps with burnout throughout the day. So that's number 2. And I would say the last one is, when you do feel overwhelmed and you feel like you're paralyzed, because oftentimes I get in that place where I have so much to do that I don't do anything. And I think in that moment, it takes discipline, but simply ask yourself, what do I need in this moment? And you know the answer. We all know this answer. And I think the answer that you get might be to eat something, to take a nap, to take a walk, right? Like, we all know what we need to do. We just keep pushing ourselves because that's part of our hustle culture, right? And so when you feel that sense of overwhelm, it's a great time to ask yourself, like, what do I need in this moment that's just going to help me get through this period of feeling so fatigued?
Yeah, what a brilliant thing to do. And I think that's this whole thing, isn't it? And you'll know from your psychological background, being our own inner parent sometimes, and just
Yeah.
saying, if I was a small child, yeah, what would I need right now?
Exactly. And oftentimes we think it's so complicated, but it literally could be,
Mm,
I need a 15-minute nap, or I need to eat something, or I need to drink something, because you've been going back to back, meeting after meeting, and you just forget about your body budget,
mm,
right? And we
mm.
want to make sure that we're always looking after ourselves.
Thank you, Neelu. It's been brilliant to speak to you. And if people want to know more about you and your work, I will, of course, include this in the show notes, but how should they contact you?
Yeah, so my website, neelukaur.com. LinkedIn, I'm very active under my name. That's my most active platform. I'm also on Instagram, Neelu Kaur, and you can find Be Your Own Cheerleader on anywhere you can read books. Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and even at local bookstores. If you ask them to carry the book, they will carry it. So you can access the physical book. You can also find me on Audible and Spotify and all of those places where you can get your books.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Neelu. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, get your perspective. And of course, you've rounded up our series for Women's History Month, all about systemic change and progress. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It's been brilliant. And listeners, stay tuned because next month we're going to be talking about decolonization, what it means, how to do it, and why it's relevant to you. Until then, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.